Hello, I'm Nancy Howell, one of the directors of the Center for Process Studies. I want to welcome you to this tape, which is produced by the Process and Faith program of our center. Today, I'm interviewing Ignacio Castuera, who is a pastor in the California Pacific Conference of the United Methodist Church. Today, we'll be talking about process theology and liberation theology. I suppose the best place to start is to ask you to tell us just what liberation theology is.
Well, one very quick way of talking about liberation theology is simply to say that it is that kind of theology that is being done by those people who are oppressed and who take their oppression as a serious point of departure or as a serious ingredient in their theologizing. Now, then one would have to say that there are different types of liberation theology, because women who take their oppression as women seriously are doing feminist liberation theology, blacks, other people like Koreans. I'm particularly interested in Hispanic liberation theology or Latin American liberation theology. So when one asks more specifically what is Latin American liberation theology, is that kind of theology that has been done for approximately now 20 years and which has taken very seriously the oppression of the peoples of Latin America. And one also would say that those people heretofore had been silent or silenced, and for the first time got to speak, primarily with the impetus of both in the Catholic side, the Vatican II, and the openness that the Roman Catholic Church had to the world and the winds that were blowing into the Catholic Church. And on the side of the Protestant Church, we had the movement from Geneva, from the World Council of Churches. The Church and Society movement began taking seriously what does it mean to do theology in a revolutionary situation. So when both Catholics and Protestants almost simultaneously began thinking seriously about what it meant to live as Christians under conditions of oppression, liberation theology was born.
What are the resources for liberation theology?
Well, obviously, being Christian theology, one primary resource is the Bible. But what makes this type of theology significantly different from other types of theology is that the liberation theologians from Latin America sort of have put on the lenses of the poor, the glasses of the poor, so to speak, and have reread the texts and have rediscovered themselves also in the biblical narratives. By taking seriously their sense of oppression, the stories such as the liberation of people from Pharaoh, or stories where parables where Jesus refers to a rich man and a poor man begging at his door, suddenly took new meanings for them. And by taking the Bible seriously as oppressed people, then that theology of liberation began to emerge. The other thing that was extremely important for them was to do a careful analysis of society, because it is possible to look at poverty or at oppression and sort of dismiss it, because you could say, well, the reason people are poor is because they drink too much, have too many children, are lazy, all kinds of things that one can say. However, by having the right kind of social analysis, economic analysis, then you can come up with a totally different kind of a situation where you realize that the conditions of the people who are poor are not conditions that they have brought upon themselves, but rather that they obey other more important oppressive forces. So the Bible, social and economic analysis, historical analysis also. In some instances, one has to be quite candid and admit that Marxism has been a tool that has been used by some of the liberation theologians, although not all of the liberation theologians from Latin America have used that. And I emphasize the idea of tool because they pose some Marxist questions but answer with Christian replies.
What experiences do the oppressed bring to theology?
Well, I think that the most important experience that they bring is that of feeling marginated or being marginated. And marginalized, that's another way of putting it. I think that one of the best ways in which, or more succinct ways in which I have ever seen it, was put by Hugo Asman, who is a Brazilian theologian, and he talked about the hermeneutical privilege of the oppressed. And by that he meant that in some way those persons who are oppressed in some way can understand some of the texts of the Bible better than those of us who have all of the screens of upper middle class upbringing and biases and predilections, etc., which the very, very poor do not have. And sometimes when they hear "blessed are the poor," they don't have to interpret, well, poor means this or poor means that. They really seriously take it that the poor are blessed. And that is it's a new datum, in a sense, that has entered into Christian theology through the poor. I'll leave it at that for now. So.
Okay. Can you say just a little more about what that means in terms of new insights brought to theology or an understanding of the Bible?
I think that perhaps the most important new insight was that, and of course, this is particularly good for those of us who are either Latin American or of Latin American background, and that is that in the past, we thought that we were not capable or worthy of doing theology. That most of us had to learn the theologies that had been developed in Europe or in North America. By having Latin Americans do theology, a new sense of integrity came to all Latin American Christians. And the particular insight that came out of that is the kind of, I don't want to call it specifically relativity of theology, but at least the contextuality of theology, that all theology is contextual to a certain degree, and that if we do not take seriously the context out of which one emerges, if we don't take seriously the context where the questions are asked, then the answers are going to be biased one way or the other. That, I think, is a very important concept for us in theology.
How does the pastor of a North American church bring the experiences of the oppressed to a congregation?
Well, it isn't easy. I think it has been a little bit easier lately because of the many liberation struggles in Latin America that have been really on the forefront of our life because of the involvement of the United States, for instance, in Nicaragua and Grenada and places like that. So it is easy, at least, to begin to make connections with the realities of the people in Latin America. But by and large, I think the hardest task is to help the people realize two things. One is that our lifestyle in the United States is connected in some way with the lifestyle of the people in Latin America and, in fact, of the Third World. So that even if we're not direct oppressors of the Latin American people, we certainly contribute to their oppression simply by wanting a lot more of that good Brazilian coffee or that Colombian blend or something along those lines. In a more sophisticated way, I think and I think more importantly, a pastor can help members of the congregation to understand their own oppression as well, and to then realize that solidarity with the people of Latin America has also a payoff that is very personal, because people in Latin America and in the United States, in my opinion, are also very much oppressed. And maybe by discovering the oppression of the people in Latin America, they'll also begin to get in touch with their own oppression and with their own need for liberation.
We're interested in process theology here. Can you tell me how process theology is related to liberation theology?
Well, I came to liberation theology as a second theology for me, or a second style of theologizing. I was acquainted first with process thought. Even before I came to the School of Theology at Claremont, I was very fortunate in that both in my junior college and in my years at Cal State Long Beach, I had 2 or 3 professors who were very much acquainted with the thought of Whitehead, and sort of prepared me to come over here. It was also providential I landed here. I did not know John Cobb from John the Evangelist, but when I first heard John talk about affirming God in a non-theistic age, which was his Ingraham Professor lectureship, something immediately clicked in me, and I realized that it was precisely because he was using Whiteheadian categories with which I was somewhat familiar. So I immediately fell in love with process theology, and I consider myself primarily a process theologian. And when I think hermeneutically, when I think theologically, I go first to the categories of process thought. But I also felt, especially after I left seminary, which is when I first encountered liberation theology, that there was a lacuna in North American and North Atlantic theology in dealing with the problems of justice, not just for Latin America, but already we had already begun to address the issues of the persecutions or segregations of people of different races, women and persons with different lifestyle, gay and lesbian persons. People who were marginalized were beginning to talk about the fact that if they were going to be Christians, their own sense of oppression had to be taken equally seriously. And so I was prepared for the possibility of something like the Latin American theology of liberation. And so when I first encountered it, I saw it as a good, I don't want to call it corrective, but as a good conversation partner with process theology. And I think that the main reason for that was that I learned through process theology to think about God in categories that were not traditional categories. And so to introduce the concept of God as liberator or Jesus Christ as liberator was not completely foreign to me. I mean, it wasn't as though jumping from God the Father to God the liberator. I had gone already from God the Father through God as understood by process thinking and then God the liberator. And so it was a lot easier for me to be open to that. And I began to see the connections that could exist there. Especially really in terms of challenging all categories of thinking, which can be as oppressive as someone actually holding a gun to our heads and saying, do this or do that.
Could you be more specific about some of the particular connections that you can make between the two?
Well, I think that for me the most important connection that can be done is that in order to really attain liberation, we must not adopt the tools or the methods of the oppressor. And I saw that many liberation theologians were far more willing to adopt those measures than I was, for instance, and I could see how they could keep on perpetuating the constant revolutions that happen in Latin America. And liberation is far deeper than revolution. And in order for that to occur, I thought that people needed to hold on or grasp for a concept of God that could be far more inclusive, a God that was not some kind of a monarch that was going to sort of replace the other monarchs of this land, but rather someone that was going to redefine what it means to rule, what it means to attract someone into doing something. Notions of power that are very much present in process thinking are very good correctives, really, to some of the just raw power versus raw power that sometimes you find in Latin American thinking.
Well, this is really interesting, Ignacio. We thank you for helping us to understand a little bit about the relationship of process theology to liberation theology. Welcome back to this videotape on process theology and liberation theology. The Process and Faith program has been pleased to have Ignacio Castuera here to talk with us about this topic. Right now, we'd like to focus a little more specifically on theological questions and talk especially about Jesus Christ from the perspective of liberation theology. One question I'd really like to start with has to do with Christianity and liberation theology. Christianity has been associated with religion as an oppressive thing. So how can Christianity be transformed into something that's important for a liberating process?
Right. I think you're absolutely correct, especially in the Latin American context, that Christianity from the very beginning came in as the religion of the oppressors, as the religion of the Spaniards. Fortunately, there were always enough exceptions to that rule that the more what I would want to call typical or true to Christ teachings remained there. And even though it wasn't called theology of liberation at that time, there were enough people, enough priests, enough religious leaders, enough lay people who still maintained the teachings of Christianity about caring for the poor and about caring for the marginalized and opposing those who were oppressing them. And only when that part of Christianity was generalized to overcome the powerful, could then Christianity be more seriously taken as an agency or as a way of liberating people? Now that didn't happen just overnight, and it really had to have the assistance of the leadership of the church, responding to the forces that were coming from the bottom. And so Vatican II, on the Catholic side, can be seen as a response to movements, grassroots movements that were saying the church is too oppressive, we need to do something new. Now Vatican II, I don't think, foresaw what would happen in the Latin context. Once the Latin American priests, nuns, lay people who were working closer to the poor heard the permission from John the 23rd and from Popularum Progressio to really begin looking at the poor more seriously and to look at the texts in Christianity that deal with poverty and how to deal with the poor, then of course Christianity had a liberating power. And what I consider the original liberating message of Christianity was again appropriated by the oppressed. That's the other kind of thing. It can only be a liberating religion when people who are self-conscious of their own oppression adopt and adapt the message of Christianity to their context.
I see. How then do we understand Jesus Christ in the context of the need for liberation?
I think that in order to best understand how liberation theologians have appropriated both the image and the history and the symbol of Jesus Christ for liberation, one has to look at the two extremes that have been used in Latin America to talk about Jesus. And Jose Miguel Bonino took those extremes and put them together as the title of a collection of essays on Christology. And it was called Neither Celestial Monarch Nor Defeated Christ. These have been the two poles, so to speak. You know, we have had these images, these icons of a very defeated Christ carrying the cross or already crucified, totally powerless. Or on the other side, the almost the Christ Pantocrator of the Greeks, you know, just floating above the universe, totally unconcerned with the realities of people. And so these two images are just not in touch with the realities of the people in Latin America. And so what liberation theologians tried to do was to take the two sides and take what is positive in each one of the two. I think that it is important to have a crucifix for liberation theologians. That is, something about the seriousness of the pain of the poor is also portrayed in the crucified Christ. Something, not all of it. And also something about the longings of the poor to be victorious is reflected in the symbol of the Christ Pantocrator, the ruler of the universe. And I think that the liberation theologians have tried to steer that middle road position, bring in the best which is in both of those symbols, and saying to the oppressed people, God in Jesus Christ cares about your pain, but does not want to sanctify that pain. Rather wants to transform that pain, the longings that are in people who are oppressed, into a force that will bring about some of the victory that you see or you have seen through the centuries in these images of the victorious Christ. I think that the problem with only having the victorious Christ would be that the one moves in the direction of a triumphalistic kind of religion, while the other is a defeatist type of religion. And I think that that liberation theologians have succeeded, in my opinion, in connecting the people to a Christ and to a God in Christ who cares about them and who doesn't want to leave them where they are.
How can process theology support an understanding of Christ in liberation theology?
I'm going to refer specifically to John Cobb's idea of Christ as the principle of creative transformation. That, to me, is a very powerful symbol. For one, the idea of the ongoingness of Christ, rather than dealing with a static Christ, fits very well with what liberation theologians are trying to do. Either one of the two images that Miguel Bonino talks about is a static image. Either the image of a crucified Christ that just suffers pain, or a Christ Pantocrator that just lords over the universe and floats above reality. Either one of those, in fact, is a very static kind of an image of Christ. The process categories allow for a more creative, organic, moving, processive kind of a Christ that is present in the impulses of the poor to try to liberate themselves. So it isn't just present way back then in 33 AD in Golgotha, or in the middle of the Mediterranean world, whenever they came up with the idea of the Christ Pantocrator, but it's present right now, right here, transforming the longings, the very good longings for freedom, for liberation that people have, and transforming them creatively also. It's not just saying, you can baptize anything that says we're going to overcome these other people. I think that John is very careful in saying that Christ is present in the longings of the people to be free. And sometimes those longings may not be realized 100%, but the longings will continue and do continue, and they are reinterpreted in the next generation. We already have basically a second generation of liberation theologians who are thinking more seriously about Christology and who are already realizing that they need categories that were not present there in the past for them. And I think process can be a very good conversation partner.
So if we look at liberation theology and at Christ from the perspective of process thought, what process thought has to say is that Christ is liberator and that Christ gives us hope. There is nothing necessarily that is status quo or fixed, but that things can really change.
Exactly. And that is an idea which is extremely powerful, and people, and I know that even liberation theologians have said that they do not trust a lot of the philosophical categories of the North Atlantic. And I have been in conversation with many of them, and I have seen changes. In fact, when I was in Brazil and I gave a copy to Hugo Asman of To Set at Liberty by Delwyn Brown, he was extremely impressed. He read it overnight, and the next morning he just wanted to talk about it and realized that his prejudices against philosophical categories was ill-founded, that there were people who could use philosophical categories towards the liberation of people, and that the problem was not just in the philosophical categories, but in the persons who are wielding those categories. See, in the past, liberation theologians summarily had just nixed anyone who was using philosophical categories, other than, those sociological / philosophical categories of Marxism. And they were extremely suspicious of those of us who were trying to put the two together. I think since Delwyn Brown's To Set at Liberty, things have really changed in the conversations between process theologians and liberation theologians.
What doors are opened when you take this approach to an understanding of Christ?
The doors that are open, especially among the Roman Catholics, by understanding Christ as a principle of creative transformation, and not just simply tied to a male image. One of the most important doors that are open is for women to see themselves reflected in the story of the Christ. And one of the most exciting pieces of work that has come out of liberation theology in the last 5 years is Elsa Tamés, The Bible of the Poor, and the interviews that she did of the major figures in liberation theology. And that was called Machismo and Liberation Theology. I think that's the title in English. And if they keep it up with what it was in Spanish, I think Orbis is about ready to release it in '88. So Tamés probably would have been non-existent as a theologian had it not been for the kind of openness that thinking about Christ in different ways can, by thinking about Christ in different ways, women can come in and start theologizing and start thinking together. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that process theology has opened that door. But it seems to me that process theology, certainly in the United States, has intimately been tied or connected with the efforts to redefine the nature of God, the nature of Christ. And I think that's a door that is very important, that has opened up.
Certainly, Latin American and South American women who are doubly oppressed need all the encouragement they can get to become involved in the theological process.
Exactly. And sometimes we think that the Roman Catholics are more oppressed. I happen to believe that at least at one time in the history of Latin America, Protestant women began finding ways of expressing themselves that were not open to them as Roman Catholics. But I think there was a sort of a point of diminishing returns, and there had been a sort of plateau that had been reached where women were sort of back in the traditional roles. I think when liberation theology came on the scene, and Christology in particular was focused on as an important issue, and by thinking about Christ not just strictly as a male, but as a symbol and as a principle of transformation, then that began opening things. Now, as I said earlier, it doesn't mean that automatically they use that language, but in fact they were doing that kind of thinking.
Are there problems with this approach to understanding Christ?
Most of the problems that I have encountered in dealing with Christ as the symbol or the principle of creative transformation, most of the objections really have been North American or North Atlantic objections. I really have not encountered much in Latin America thinking, other than there are some people that contend that by symbolizing Christ, we detach the symbol Christ from the historical person Jesus and the crucifixion of Jesus. To me, that is the most important objection, and I'm not sure that it really has been carefully articulated by anyone. I think several of us, more from a distance, have pointed out the need to connect the cross with the principle of creative transformation, and I think that process theology is open to that possibility. I have insisted, even in writing, that creative transformation on the cross is a way of putting these concerns together and overcoming what could be the major area of concern, that again the principle of creative transformation would end up being also a floating principle that doesn't land. I don't think it happens that way, but I can see how some of the liberation theologians and some of the North Atlantic theologians could think that it would be just another principle floating and totally disembodied as a kind of a new docetism, where again we have Christ floating around without any connection to the real world.
Well, we may need to depend on liberation theologians like you who understand process thought to personalize Jesus and to make more historical the connection between Jesus Christ and that idea of creative transformation in a way that can be meaningful to those who are oppressed.
That would be a good task. Thank you.
Thank you for this interview.